Well, it's interesting to go back in time and look at the beginning or the origins of NCCIE, even where we came up with that name, the National Center for Collaboration of Indigenous Education. At the time, I was president of First Nations University. And as president, you're always looking for projects of ideas, concepts that are valuable to students, to the communities, to the university, and the larger community of universities across Canada. And one of the ideas that we were looking at and examining was the idea of Indigenous education. And so we have an Elders Council at First Nations University as well, and we were talking about different ideas. And the one idea came up with, well, why don't we just document all the thousands of stories that are going on across Canada in Indigenous communities with respect to Indigenous education. Why don't we just go across Canada and put teams together that can gather the stories of what the communities are doing with respect to Indigenous education? So the concept was born. My job as president was to take that concept, develop it, and seek funding. And the proposal itself went through many different iterations before we came up with the final concept that was fundable. And the federal government, and primarily Minister Bennett and her team, were the primary team to look at this and to fund this project and take it to, past its inception, to the wonderful, great project that it is today, and to gather these stories. Fortunately, technology had evolved to the point where we could hire students to go out with their iPhones, supply the iPhones and some training, and go out and capture stories, and then build the technical infrastructure where those stories could be downloaded, put onto a website, and then shared to the many people across Canada. About 17 different national teams across Canada of researchers, primarily through various universities in Canada, go through the ethical requirements and approvals that have to be done for a project this size, both at universities and also in communities, hire the students that could go out into the communities, build that capacity for them to collect those stories, and at the same time build the infrastructure, the technical infrastructure that was needed and required in order to put all those kind of stories on a digital platform. Well, Indigenous education is about language and it's about culture. So our very first banner should have Indigenous languages built into it, and it should have our culture built into it. So if you look at NCCIE on the website and the initial banner, you will see Indigenous education in English on the right. So you'll see a scrolling bar on the left-hand side that looks at how we would describe Indigenous education from the various communities in their different languages across Canada. In the center, the logo is to represent our culture. The circle, which represents, and again, First Nations universities in the prairies, the circle is there to represent the medicine wheel concept and to look at the holistic nature of education from an Indigenous perspective. You'll see in the middle 3 flames. That was to symbolize the mind, the body, and the spirit, the 3 components of the human being that are given to us from creation. And that fire burning in the center represents a number of different things. One, the fire that burns within us, that curiosity within every individual to learn and to learn more. It also represents that fire that burns in ceremonies. For example, in teepees, at the center of the teepee, that fire is there to remind us of the fire of creation, the energy of creation, and all that flow from creation. And you'll see that circle, there is some symbols there. That came from a particular teaching of an elder from Ontario, and it's called Stones and Bones. And the idea was that our traditional ways of knowing and understanding, our Indigenous education, was disrupted through colonization. And through that process of disruption, and in many cases it being illegal, that there were those who went around and found ways around the enforcement, police and missionaries and others who did not want this to be part of the education system. And they used stones and bones that they would put on the ground and use visuals that they would create in order to teach, in order for the traditional ways of knowing and understanding to be passed on in our traditional ways through an oral tradition. And those stones and bones represent the idea that even through the dark period, that fire, that thirst for knowledge continued through to the present. Through the sacrifices of many, we have our Indigenous education system still intact today in many ways. It also represents people holding hands, perhaps, or some say it looks like a buffalo head with horns, where buffalo is the new education, and represents the idea that education brings us all the things that the buffalo used to, that is, all the things that we need to survive. So it was a lot of work went into how we represent ourselves in this project, how we ensure that it is First Nations run, First Nations controlled, First Nations operated, and we tell the stories of First Nations communities, some Indigenous peoples across Canada. It's very important to ensure that our culture was represented at the very first outset of the logo, and that our languages are well represented as well. So it's not just English, and it's not just academics, it's our languages, our culture, and the community speaking to other communities. The idea being, again, that circle of sharing that is in our logo, that our ways of knowing, our traditional ways of understanding that have been carried through from generation to generation, despite the darkness, that flame still burns bright. And this is a platform for communities to share with each other and to share with Canadian society, generally speaking, so that we all become better informed. We all become part of the dialogue, part of the discussion, which is, by definition, reconciliation. My role was basically, as president, to find a concept that resonates with students, with the university, with the larger communities, both within Saskatchewan and across Canada, to do something that will not only assist First Nations, but assist us, all citizens of Canada, to learn more about Indigenous education. To do that, as any good leader will tell you, is to come up with the concept, to get the funding, and then step aside. When you hire a bunch of wonderful people to then take that concept and put it into practice and to find ways in order to make that work. So that's the story and the origins of where it came from and how it was put together, with the concept of not only looking at it from Indigenous perspectives, but to have elders involved at the very outset. And other projects came from this. If you go to NCCIE, you'll see the elders at First Nations University. They came up with videos of Indigenous education. And the unique part about that was we let the elders be the directors of their own film. Again, Indigenous concepts of we can do these things, we are in control, we decide what happens, and from a First Nations perspective, we use that as the first point or the stepping stone for the discussion, the conversation that follows from that. Knowing that at the end of year one and into year two, that we would have the teams ready, that the infrastructure, both the ethics review, for example, and the technical platforms would all be ready to put all these stories onto the platform for everybody to share. Year three, what we do with all the information. How is it that we make this resource applicable to not only Indigenous communities, but to others as well? And of course, the discussion around reconciliation was a major discussion at the time. So year three, in the latter parts of the project, was the idea of translating or transmitting or modifying the information so that we could put it into lesson plans, for example, and those lesson plans could then be used by many others who are in the education system generally across Canada and want to know more about Indigenous perspectives of education. What's going on in the communities? What are they doing from a First Nations perspective that could be valuable to our discussions in a larger context in Canadian society and within educational institutions? And how can we integrate that into the work that we do? So NCCIE evolved and started to use the information collected and translate that into lesson guides, lesson plans, and various other tools that can be used by those who are looking to integrate more Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous ways of knowing and understanding, or community voices into the work that they do. So you'll find on NCCIE that there's access to a number of different resources, the teaching guides, the lesson plans, as well as other videos, in addition to the stories that are there. And one of the resources that you'll find very useful on NCCIE is the Virtual Teachers Resource Guide that is not only there on the site as a mechanism or as a tool to use with respect to Indigenous education, but a practical application of the information that people can have a ready resource available to them, that they can search the site, they can utilize. So in summary, a fantastic project that came about through the work of many people, that came about from a great idea that germinated and started with the elders. And I said my role was merely to take that, to evolve it to the point where we could get some funding and to get it in place to implement, and then have the team take over from there, which they've done. And the result, from many perspectives, not only mine, but I think many across Canada, have been that it's a wonderful project, a treasure, really, of information, and a wonderful resource for us to share in, to be a part of, and to continue the discussion about Indigenous education and reconciliation. So thanks very much.